My name is Inge Auerbacher, and I am a survivor. I often reflect on the situations that shaped my life, including living through the Nazi Holocaust. My yellow star branded me as an outcast to society. It signified the years spent in a concentration camp, during which the Nazis attempted to strip me of my dignity at every turn. I clung to my faith in the Star of David, and I had the great fortune to avoid the death sentence. A short time after coming to the United States, I was faced with the second death sentence, the disease known as tuberculosis. Had the first antibiotic, Streptomycin, to cure TB not been discovered, there was a good chance that TB would have claimed my life, just as it claimed the lives of millions of others during that time. While growing up, I had always presumed that Dr. Selman Waksman discovered streptomycin. Years later, I found out that his graduate student, Albert Schatz, was the driving force behind finding this cure. I became very interested to know more about Dr. Albert Schatz and wondered how such a historic discovery came about. This is the account of a man's determination to find a cure for tuberculosis, one of the most virulent killers of all time. This is the story of finding Dr. Schatz, the discovery of streptomycin, and the life it saved. I was born on December 31, 1934, in a little village called Kippenheim, very near France and Switzerland. My early years were actually happy. I was the last Jewish child born in this village. I mean, we were not millionaires, but we were very comfortable middle-class people. And the day that changed everything happened on November 10th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass. That is when the Holocaust really started. My grandfather went to the synagogue in the morning to say his morning prayers, and he was arrested in the synagogue and sent to Dachau concentration camp. The police came to our house, arrested my father also just because he was Jewish. All men from the age of 16 on were arrested on that day in Germany and in Austria. And the synagogues in almost all the villages and cities were burned or desecrated. I was only 3 years old at that time, just before my 4th birthday, but I remember it as if it happened yesterday. They were knocking on the large door that we had. We heard the crashing of glass and yelling, and they were knocking on the door. They wanted to come inside. Somehow late at night it stopped, and we went to our neighbor's house. We thought all this would blow over, and this 2-3 day riot, Crystal Night, Night of Broken Glass, opened our eyes quite vividly. My father, my grandfather were allowed to come back, broken down, obviously. When my grandfather died, he died right after coming home from Dachau of a broken heart, both spiritually and physically. He couldn't believe that his country that he loved had forsaken him. My father realized then, it's time to leave Germany, high time. But the doors to the free world were closing very rapidly. We tried every which way to get out. So we thought, let's sell our house. We packed up our belongings and moved in with my grandparents in a smaller village. one Jewish school for the whole state of Württemberg in Stuttgart. And I had to get special travel permission papers to go to that school. It was also the time when the yellow Star of David had to be stitched to your clothing from the age of 6 on. The yellow star with the word Jude on it, in Hebrew-like letters, meaning Jew. I was branded. In 1941 also, at that time, the transports began from that part of Germany. And almost all the children from my school were sent to Riga in Latvia, where almost all of them were sent to the Birkenike forest and shot. A list was given and you got your number and you had to go. I had a number, Roman numeral 13-1-408. That was my number. We arrived in a town called Terezin, or Theresienstadt in German. The whole place was quite run down. We landed up in one of those stone barracks in the attic. It was very hot. It was August. Lying on the bare floor with nothing except a blanket. It was a way station before Auschwitz. It was a place where you hold, like in a pen, like you hold animals before the slaughter. 2/3 would be shipped out to Auschwitz, to the killing center. Or there were some other camps they shipped them to, but mainly Auschwitz. 1/3, almost 1/3 died there of malnutrition and disease. Almost everybody was sent out in 1944. It was around our high holidays. Never will forget it, how these people stuck to the religion. They prayed till the last minute for help. The help never came, unfortunately. I had a talk with God at that point. You decide what is best for me. I mean, it's terrible to think that I'm putting this burden on God, but I was a little girl praying to God, saying my own prayers. You decide what is best for me. I'm a little bit leery. Where are they going to? What's going to happen to them? And of course, it was a miracle that I survived. We had about 15,000 children in the camp, under the age of 15. About 1% made it, and I'm one of them. There were already some children sick at that time, and there was a scarlet fever epidemic. And certainly after a week or so, whatever the incubation time was, I had scarlet fever, and I was placed in the so-called hospital. One girl, a friend of ours, we were told, do not go near her. She has a terrible disease. You will catch it, and it's a very bad disease. But she was getting a little bit more food, a little bit of milk, and a little, perhaps a little bit more bread or something. And I was so jealous of her. I said, I want that disease. I want to be like her. I can get a little bit more food. And I actually prayed for it. I said, whatever she has, I would like to have. And it was tuberculosis. So in a way, I prayed for something that the answer to my prayer would come true, unfortunately, years later, and it would change my life forever, forever.
Tuberculosis is a disease caused by a slow-growing microbe called Mycobacterium tuberculosis. It's been plaguing humankind since we left the trees, maybe even before then.
It's a bacterium that's found in humans. It's not found in the environment. It's transmitted from person to person, generally through an aerosol, and causes significant disease in humans, largely pulmonary disease.
In the United States, it was known as the White Plague. And the reason for that is because it kills, even to this day, almost 2 million people worldwide. And in the last 2 centuries, probably 1 billion persons.
Any therapy is problematic if the organism grows slowly.
Tuberculosis was almost a death sentence. People who developed tuberculosis often died over a period of weeks to months to years.
Active disease can range from having minimal or no symptoms to having the classic symptoms of weight loss, night sweats, coughing up blood, severe weakness, and what appears to be consumption or being consumed, although you're able to walk and function for a prolonged period of time.
When you have tuberculosis, you get to the part of the day, say the middle of the day, and your energy's gone, and it's gone. There are no reserves. You're down to the bottom.
Numerous really futile efforts were thrown at it to try and control the disease. Some of the more popular ones included sense of fresh air therapy. When people went to the TB sanatoriums in the Adirondacks, those had their heyday in the late 1800s and early 1900s, where people would go to these secluded areas and breathe fresh air and rest.
My father was the last director of the Trudeau Sanatorium, and the whole town of Saranac Lake was based on tuberculosis. There were many, many cure cottages that sprang up, and people would come and stay.
You were not able to leave these sanatoria without some mode of transportation. It was done in a way to keep you secluded. When you went up there, they would do different things like expose you to the elements during the entire year, so a lot of fresh air. You were asked to drink lipid or fat-laden shakes during the day. You were in bed most of the day. You were only allowed to get up from the bed to relieve yourself of body waste. And they did things like heliotherapy, which is expose your body to sunlight. And finally, they would do prophylactic pneumothoraces. They would try and collapse your lungs, and they put in these pellets.
I really looked sick, and to a couple of friends, they were sure I was going to die. It was a possibility.
There was no medicine at that time. You had to have bed rest. You were not allowed to do anything.
I discovered that I had tuberculosis when I went to Bellevue Hospital for physical examination. At that time, there were so many TB patients at Bellevue. There's no room in the ward. They put me in the corridor. They put the bed in the corridor, and I stayed in corridor for a while.
We came here to America, and I started to get a cold, which didn't improve. It just got worse. My parents took me to a private doctor, and he looked at me, he took x-rays, and he said, "You have to go to the hospital immediately." It was a children's hospital called Sunshine Cottage. You had 2 floors. One was polio downstairs, and the upper one was tuberculosis. I was in bed there for close to 2 years. I was one of the sickest children. I couldn't believe it. Here I'd just been liberated from a camp. I knew what the hospitals were like in the camp. I just was hysterical. I was mad. Why do I have to be cooped up again in prison, and to be told what to do and not to get off my bed? All I wanted was to become a normal child. That's all. I didn't have to be a genius to be able to have friends, to go and to do what other children do at that age.
Albert was born in Norwich, Connecticut, but also he spent a lot of his early years on his grandparents' farm. He went to Passaic High School, and he didn't know if he was going to go to college because of the funds. So when his father got the bonus check that the World War I veterans had been really struggling hard for, he said to him, "Son, now you can go to college." And nobody in the family had gone to college. He wanted to major in agriculture because of his history on the farm. And he went to the College of Agriculture at Rutgers University.
I wanted to be a farmer when I graduated. I had spent my early years on a farm in Connecticut, and when I went to Rutgers, that was my objective. I knew there was a College of Agriculture, but I had no idea about what the College of Agriculture was.
Dr. Waksman was a microbiologist at Rutgers, and he had his main interest there was in developing antibiotics. So at that time, Dr. Waksman was having research done on some of the antibiotics that had already been developed in the laboratory.
I began graduate work with Waksman in June of 1942. I worked on the fumaric acid production. Fumaric acid is an industrial chemical. This was during the war, and Waksman wanted to see if he could produce a fermentation which gave a higher yield of fumaric acid.
November 11th, actually Armistice Day, he was drafted. He was sent to an Army hospital in Miami where he was a bacteriologist. And his work there was to take samples, blood samples, throat samples from sick soldiers and see whether they had gram-positive or gram-negative infections.
When he was in the army, he saw the soldiers dying of infections, which penicillin did not cure. So they needed something that would take the slack that penicillin wouldn't cure.
That sadness really got him started looking for antibiotics against gram-negative bacteria. And he began in the Army on his spare time doing that.
That makes a difference sometimes. You can see what the real world out there instead of somebody telling you how bad it is. You see for yourself. You're more driven and more dedicated, more committed.
He worked in an Army lab for microbiology, and he had sent back samples to Dr. Waksman for study later on. And there was papers coming out at that time showing that certain microbes yielded antibiotics, just like fungus yields penicillin, and there was an interest in this.
If I had any cultures which produced something that inhibited growth of gram-negative bacteria, I sent the cultures to Waksman, my department head, at Rutgers for further testing.
Following his discharge from the Army, because of an injury that he suffered, as I remember, in the Army, he applied to Dr. Waksman to be his PhD student. Dr. Waksman approved of his study. He also got Dr. Waksman to agree that he study tuberculosis live bacilli in culture media and to try these soil organisms against it.
Waksman built up a project that involved many people. And that project was to study soil bacteria, trying to find something that would kill the other bacteria. So it's a screening that involved a lot of people.
He worked in a basement at Rutgers in the same building to which Dr. Waksman had gotten a grant from a pharmaceutical company to look for antibiotics derived from soil organisms.
What he had to do was isolate as many soil organisms as possible and see which ones would be effective against gram-negative bacteria. And he just worked hard at that. He analyzed a lot of field soils, heavily manured soils, all kinds of soils.
These bacteria that cause TB, they kill other bacteria, and they are killed by other bacteria. So basically, if you can find an organism that would kill the disease-causing bacteria, then one could basically develop a new treatment.
He knew exactly what to do. He really worked on his own. Dr. Waksman moved Albert to the basement laboratory. Waksman would never go down to the basement laboratory once Albert began working with the virulent human strain of tuberculosis. And since Albert had worked with virulent organisms in the Army, he was very, very careful.
A reporter tactfully and diplomatically and circuitously asked me, "Is it true that you worked under Dr. Waksman?" I said, "Absolutely." She was a little startled. I said, "He was on the third floor and I was on the basement floor directly under him."
By October 19th, 1942, he knew he had an organism that was effective against gram-negative bacteria and effective against tuberculosis. And what he did was seal the organism in a test tube, and he took it home to his parents. because he shared all his experimental work with his parents and his Uncle Joe. So that test tube stayed with his parents all their lives.
He isolated 2 strains of Streptomyces. One, it was called Streptomyces griseus. The 2 strains that Dr. Schatz isolated were viable, and they did produce the antibiotic streptomycin. Dr. Waksman had Streptomyces griseus. However, his strain did not produce streptomycin.
And of course, it's finding the needle in the haystack, you know. But if you don't start, you can't find it. And basically, you know, Schatz picked the right strain that showed for the first time inhibition of the growth of the TB-causing bacteria.
He had to start producing enough streptomycin for the Mayo Clinic to begin doing toxicity tests.
He was working day and night at this in his laboratory in the basement, sleeping on a bench in this laboratory. And he hit the payload.
His Erlenmeyer flasks marked with a red mark. And if the liquid in the Erlenmeyer flask got below the red mark or got near the red mark, the night watchman would wake him up and say, it's time to wake up and add some more liquid.
After he discovered a bacterium that gave this effect, he studied this bacterium to find the actual substance, which is streptomycin. Now, this is not a simple technical part to do that. The discoverer of penicillin never purified penicillin. Somebody else did. But here you have a student in the basement working and under primitive condition, enduring a lot of personal hardship, with a goal and being convinced that he can do it, you know. And he came up with enough purified streptomycin that the people at the Mayo Clinic could test it on guinea pigs and make sure that this is really the effective component of the discovered bacterium that stops the growth of the TB-causing bacteria.
It was tried in the Mayo Clinic on people who would have had absolutely no chance to live without it. Very desperately ill people. And he cured them.
Streptomycin revolutionized the treatment of tuberculosis in the middle to late 40s. Dr. Schatz published his findings in January of 1944. I believe the drug started to be used experimentally in the late 40s.
Streptomycin turned out to be probably the first drug that had some bona fide efficacy against tuberculosis.
It is one of the great serendipities in science, if you think about it. Who would have thought, if you have a devastating disease like TB, that you get the solution from working with soil bacteria?
Albert wrote the first 3 papers about streptomycin. He was the senior author, and he wrote the first 3 papers, and his thesis is totally about the discovery of streptomycin. Once it was shown to be non-toxic and effective, Waksman gave the organism to Merck.
They realized the potential of this drug, not just for TB, but also for gram-negative infections.
It was big. It would do things penicillin couldn't touch, and it served its purpose, particularly with tuberculosis. And then they discovered it could be used for other things too, other purposes for infections and apparently things that I had.
I'm one of the first group of patients agreed to use streptomycin. Streptomycin is so good. I think after a few months, 3 months or so, will clear up.
Streptomycin was given to me in very high doses. But after a few months, I felt better. It just healed me. And I became stronger and stronger.
I had a pulmonary embolism and a lot of other things associated with it, infections, and I was weak. I'd lost about 70 pounds. I even have a letter that some very insensitive second lieutenant had written my parents saying, your son is gravely ill and probably won't make it. You know, You feel free to come to visit. There was a discussion with my parents that they want to sign a release. There was no guarantee this would work. It was a new drug. I was sort of a guinea pig, at least in the U.S., or at least in that hospital for this drug that I later learned years later was streptomycin.
At that time in China, the number one killer is tuberculosis. Didn't have streptomycin. I went back to China and it just died like any other.
They say within 4 or 5 days I was sitting up, and that's pretty miraculous.
Merck didn't have even the capacity to make enough to treat all the people that there are. So what Waksman did, he went back to Merck and asked them to give back the rights to Rutgers so that Rutgers could license other pharmaceutical companies to join in the effort to produce streptomycin. The demand that existed and the suffering that there was to put the treatment of people above the consideration, what would be economically more attractive then.
When he asked me to sign the patent assignment to the Rutgers Research and Endowment Foundation, there were 2 checks, one made out to him for $1 and one made out to me for $1. And he said that neither of us would get any royalty.
It was an agreement that neither would profit, and that the Rutgers Research and Endowment Foundation would have all the income from it. So that seemed fair. And things began to unravel.
Dr. Waksman apparently was receiving royalties, as was Rutgers.
Nobody knew this, but Waksman had a secret agreement with Merck. He got $300 a month, which was an enormous amount of money at that time. Albert was making $40 a month.
In the original reports of streptomycin, which appeared in the popular press, I was mentioned, but gradually Waksman took credit for the discovery of streptomycin.
You saw in every leading magazine in the country articles about Waksman. Waksman was on the front page of Time magazine, I think, in 1949. You saw all these articles about Waksman.
All of a sudden sent me his $500 check, which surprised me. I didn't ask him for any money. He considered that payment for work which I had done for him.
The split began when Waksman wanted him to pay income tax on the $1,000 he sent him, which was like a gift. And Albert sent rather an acerbic letter, many pages long. He wanted complete financial history of what was happening.
When I spoke to him as diplomatically as I can, told him I thought that I should be mentioned, at least, he became incensed.
He kept talking with his family about what was happening with streptomycin, and they encouraged him to get a lawyer and see about suing.
Dr. Schatz apparently did not receive any credit. He eventually filed a lawsuit.
I sued Waksman on March 10th. Litigation was started on March 10th, 1950.
They never went to trial. They had to deposition a lot of the people who were involved. And finally the lawsuit was settled, I guess, December 29th, 1950, out of court. The settlement was that Waksman would continue to get 10% of the net royalties, and the other 10% would be divided up among everybody else. Albert would get 3%. Everybody was included, including the dishwashers. I think Albert got $125,000, and then he had to pay his lawyer 40% of that.
He had shown that he applied for a patent. The patent was jointly awarded both to him and Dr. Waksman, showing them as co-inventors of this drug.
There were only 2 people on the patent, and they had an agreement between them that each one should only get $1. And it should be given to humanity and also to the Rutgers Foundation.
It was a lead article in the New York Times, front page, December 30th, 1950, that he was legally declared the co-discoverer. Nobody at that time had ever sued a professor.
In 1952, the Nobel Committee bestowed the Prize of Medicine Physiology to Dr. Waksman.
When he received the Nobel Prize, Professor Aldrin from the Nobel Institute gave a presentation speech in which he said that the prize was awarded for Dr. Waksman's years of research which led to the discovery of streptomycin.
Albert was devastated when he read that Waksman was nominated for the Nobel Prize in 1952 for the discovery of streptomycin.
Clearly, having lost the Nobel Prize and having not been given either financial or appropriate credit for his discovery was a life-changing event in my view. He felt that his work, he realized, made a tremendous contribution to the treatment of this disease, yet nobody even knew that he existed.
The vice president of the National Agricultural College, where he worked at the time, wrote a letter which was sent to a lot of scientists that Albert knew and knew of, asking them to intercede about the Nobel Prize. When the Nobel Prize was awarded to Waksman, actually awarded that day, he was not given the prize for the discovery of streptomycin. He was given the prize for the work leading up to the discovery of streptomycin. So Albert thought that maybe the letters had had some influence.
In his presentation speech, he uses the word discovery of streptomycin and comments on the discovery of streptomycin in only 3 sentences in his whole presentation. He lists, I think, 24, 25 people that he thanks for collaborating in antibiotic work, and I'm one of those.
And Dr. Schatz had also mentioned to me that following this long debate with Dr. Waksman, he was no longer able to find employment in this country, and so he emigrated to South America. And he lectured in Chile, I believe, was one of the countries he spent most of his life in, and he eventually won a prize there for his work.
Today, when you look at books, and you look who discovered streptomycin, many times you will see only Selman Waksman. One day I saw an article, and on the bottom it said, Albert Schatz, Professor Emeritus, Temple University, co-discoverer of streptomycin. I thought it was Selman Waksman who discovered the antibiotic, and I always had wanted to write him a letter to thank him for saving my life. Somehow I didn't, and he died in the meantime. And when I saw that, I said, I don't believe it. I need to get in touch with that person immediately.
She wrote to him and thanked him and wanted to meet him, and I guess he called her, and she used to take the bus, so she took the bus down to 10th and Ludlow, and I told him what train to take, because he wasn't good at directions. I told him, this brilliant man, he wasn't that good at directions.
And I saw this man standing in the Greyhound bus stop with a checkered shirt, I knew that was him somehow. And I went to him, I put my arms around him, and I think we both cried. Tears came to our eyes. It was a very emotional meeting. And we went to a Chinese restaurant. We sat there, talked for about 4 hours. I don't know what I ate anymore, I just went. And he tells me this whole story, intrigue. And I said, Albert, this is a book, I'd love to write it.
He was really pleased, and he was happy to meet her, that streptomycin had saved her life.
2 people come together from different sides of the ocean, different backgrounds, that this drug brought us together. This disease actually brought us together. And he saved my life, certainly. And I wanted to save his for posterity.
Senator Bob Dole sent a letter to Albert thanking him.
And I just want to express my thanks. I was just, as I said earlier, a patient who benefited from this wonderful drug that he co-discovered, I guess would be the word.
I'm sorry I didn't meet him earlier. He was in his 9th decade of life. He was about 82, I believe. Very quiet, very polite, very reserved gentleman. He remembered those days 60 years earlier as if they were just yesterday. And there aren't many people that really treat tuberculosis. There are very few of us, so for me it was a personal thrill to meet him, and it was for our Department of Microbiology and all my colleagues in infectious diseases. They were all thrilled to meet him.
And when Albert went back to Rutgers, when he began going back, many of the people there were quite thankful to him, and they helped him get publicity about his side of the story.
His demeanor was very modest. You know, you didn't see anything that fitted right with that picture to him being, a very famous scientist.
What happened after he sued was that every graduate student at Rutgers who discovered an antibiotic that was effective was included in the financial reimbursement.
In the latter part of his life, when he returned to this country in his retirement, he tried to bring to light what had happened to him, his plight, and how he was not able to share in the discovery of a remarkable drug.
Rutgers planned a big weekend to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the discovery of streptomycin, and Albert was given the Rutgers Medal.
I was awarded the Rutgers Medal, which was the first time that the university had formally acknowledged my role in the discovery of streptomycin.
When I told him what we're going to do, I think he was very elated. He was very happy about it. I didn't feel any hesitation on his part to accept this honor.
They were very, very friendly. There's no question that they wanted me to know that I was welcome.
And at one point he stopped and he said, "Well, I'm going to say something that I was asked not to say," and everybody stiffened up. Oh, he's going to bring up the, and I knew what he was going to say. He said, 50 years ago, this time of year, I met the woman who became my wife. He had pancreatic cancer. All the while he was sick, I would tell him how important he'd been, how many lives he'd saved, and that he'd really, really done wonderful things in his life. And the day before he died, he was sleeping most of the time. I gave him a half a pint of Ben & Jerry's strawberry ice cream. And he woke up and he said, "I'm at peace with the idea of my going." And I wrote it down. I was there. I was reading the paper all day, sitting next to him on the bed, and I wrote it down on the paper.
I mean, it had a large impact, a big impact, no question about it. If you look at the difference you made, I mean, you got to be proud of yourself. A lot of people owe their life to streptomycin.
First thing I would say to you, saved my life. Yeah, see, because that's true. See, without streptomycin, I don't know what would have.
The young medical people came up to him in awe that he had worked with this virulent strain under such antique conditions. Nobody would work with the virulent human strain of tuberculosis under those conditions today.
A knowledgeable man, a man who was a pioneer and who was very persistent in looking for an organism because he believed it would actually work, and he found it.
I think what is exemplary for many students is that science expects a lot of dedication. It is not really necessary always yielding the awards that monetary awards or other awards that other professions have to offer. But there's a great deal of satisfaction in making discoveries when you suddenly see something that nobody else has seen before. So I think for a lot of graduate students this is a fantastic story.
He really liked to see TB sanatorium closed. We went to the Adirondacks in the 50s, and we passed through Saranac Lake onto where we were going, and we saw the Trudeau Sanatorium totally closed. And it was just incredible to think that his work had done that. You know, it's one thing to read in the paper that streptomycin is saving all these lives, but it's another thing to see this building after building closed. That was fantastic.
I think his legacy, number one, I still use as a clinician, I use his medication, less now because of resistance, but clearly very important. It's still a drug that would be used by our nation in the event of bioterrorist events. His more important legacy is a reminder to all of us in any kind of professional, any kind of academic research, that we should always acknowledge the contributions of those who make our own discoveries possible, because that's the only way that we will fully enjoy what we have done, by acknowledging those who preceded us. Because many times a person who makes a great discovery may be standing on the shoulders of giants.
When you find something that saves lives, it's pretty hard to beat.
If Albert could hear me now, I would say to him, with great gratitude and appreciation, I thank you forever, and I love you till the end of my time, for giving me the gift of life.